Eliot Porter was born in 1901 in Illinois. After a career in medicine and science, he turned to photography, concentrating on nature as his subject and color as his medium. His first major exhibition was organized by Alfred Stieglitz at an American Place in 1939. In 1945, Aileen and Eliot Porter bought the property in Tesuque, New Mexico, and made it home base. While the family traveled and spent time in Maine each year, Tesuque was their home. Mrs. Porter, who was a painter and sculptor, used the studio in the main house for her work. Mr. Porter used a building across from the main house for his photo developing and cataloging work. Adjacent to Mr. Porter's studio is the wood shop where Mr. Porter used his talents to make frames for his photos and the special equipment he needed to make his prints. Mrs. Louisa Seraphim acquired the property in 1993 and embarked on a renovation that would update the mechanical systems of the home while maintaining the integrity of the design. Jim Bones, who worked with Eliot Porter in the photo studio from 1975 to 1978, restored the photo shop to the functional state as Eliot would have left it at the end of a day's work. Following the darkroom restoration, Jim Bones demonstrated the photo process Mr. Porter used in a series of sessions in early 2004. This video is the outcome of those sessions.
All right, so this would be the whole layout of negatives necessary to get to the point of making the matrices. So what we have is these are the masks, okay, and the way they were made was a piece of unexposed film was put in register with the transparency in that printing frame, exposed and then developed. And then the mask is put back in register with the transparency. See how that contrast controls that? Really reduces the brightness of these clouds and these white areas in the log and in the canoe. And with that sandwich, as we called it, I would make a red filter negative, okay? And then with that piece of film still in there, with that transparency, I'd put a piece of unexposed film under that. And I would make a green filter separation negative. And then I would have to take it out of the frame, put the, actually I had that wrong, I had the clip there, let's do it right. So that would have been made with the red and the green. I would take that out and put it there. I would then put the green mask in register with that, and I would make the exposure through the blue filter for the blue filter separation. And once I had the red information in tones of gray, the green information, and the blue information, we'd put it in the enlarger. It'd make the enlarged matrices. And the way we would determine the exposure, what we would do is look for, say, the whitest white that just had some density in it. It could have been this light cloud, could have been this highlight on the log, could have been on his shirt, and we would measure that with the densitometer. And then we would look on here and say, okay, well, if that measured a density of about 2.15, where on here does it first begin to show some kind of tone? And that would be somewhere about here. So I would say, okay, at F11, a 30-second exposure for those matrices should give me something that's pretty much in the ballpark for a first go-around. And if we were really lucky, 90% of them turned out to be right guesses on the first. Prints are unique in that you would begin with a piece of plain white paper, photographic paper with no silver in the emulsion. You would then sequentially add the cyan dye, the magenta dye, the yellow dye to combine into a single print containing all three colors. And the dyes are so well balanced that you don't need a black dye as you would in offset printing. If you combine them in a balanced way, you'll get all of the colors, including a full grayscale from black to white. Almost everything that you're going to see today would be done in the dark. So we're just going to have to simulate that. With a transparency, a large 4x5 transparency or slide. This would be used to make black and white masks and then the separation negatives as well. And in the early days of Eliot's work with this, he used this device which he designed himself in order to maintain registration. You can see there are these pins which fit in holes which we would punch in the film here. And that would enable us to put everything back in registration every time we made an exposure. But what we would do is take a piece of film, we would punch it on this device here, we would then line it up on the frame, put all of this packing material back in. This is all in the dark, mind you. Total dark.
Total dark?
Total dark. Yeah, because the film is panchromatic, and any light at all would have made it fogged. So I'd put this in here, I'd make sure that the red filter was in place, I would set the timer for the appropriate exposure time, which for the red would be about 13 seconds. Take this out and then go through the same procedure in the reverse. Remembering where all these little pieces were. And then I would come over to the light safe. I would open this and I would put it in the appropriate box. And then I would turn the light position, the filter so that the green filter was in the right place. I would set the time for the green exposure, which in this case would be 5 seconds. They're all different. And then I would go through the same procedure. I would have to put in the new piece of unexposed film, put it back in the exposing box, pull the slide, make the exposure for the green negative, and go through the whole procedure. Then these were the masks. I would do the 2 masks first, the red and the green. Then I'll have to process that film and dry it, and then I would have to make a more complex sandwich, as we called it, for making the 3 separation negatives. For that, I would have to get the finished mask, put it on the pins first, put down the transparency, or in this particular case the step wedge, which we would use to calibrate things. And then I would have to get a new piece of film. This time it would be a piece of Super XX film. We use pan masking for the masking material. So I'd put that unexposed piece of film in there. Now we have 3 pieces of film. Have to put the little unit back together. Once again, all in the dark. And then we'd have to start all over again and make a whole new series of exposures, one for the red, one for the green, and this time we're going to have to make one for the blue, because we'd need the 3 different separation negatives. And once these had been exposed, then we take them in the other room and have to develop those. And at that point, we would have our separation negatives, which would have all of the color information from the original transparency recorded in shades of gray. So all of the red information is in different shades of gray, all the green information is in different shades of gray, and the blue information is in different shades of gray. Well, this is the system that replaced this. And this made things a lot easier, a lot more reproducible, higher quality actually. He had built another box that was used for this system, and it had a big slot at the bottom, and I could slide this printing frame in there. Let's bring this down and get this out.
So did he invent this process also?
He didn't invent this printing process, but he did develop, he made his own equipment. When I first came to work for Eliot, we didn't have this, and David Rathbun, his previous printer, got in touch with us and said this is what he was using in Chicago where he had started teaching, and he said, you really need one of these systems to make things efficient. And Eliot was very reluctant to do it, but finally did, and it really speeded things up. There, I'm going to put this back in here. We're going to return it to the status of being just a printing frame. So I would put the transparency in with the emulsion up so that I could make proper contact exposures. And then, effect of it, you would punch that, and see the little holes in there for registration on here. You'd put the unexposed masking film on there. Bear in mind, this is still in the dark, total dark. And then put this Let's go into the other dark room, and I'll show you what we would do with all this exposed material. Once again, in getting ready to process the film, the 4x5 film, it would have to be in total darkness. So in the dark, what I would have to do is take each of the pieces of film out of the boxes, the exposed ones, and I would load all of the red ones first. And actually, these would be closed so that I couldn't make the huge error, which I dreaded and never did. Thank goodness I never made that big error. Never opened the box when the film was exposed. So you go through, you would load up all of these. Also, of course, in the dark. Assume I have done all that for all 10 of the red images for this batch, plus one, which is that step wedge that I showed you. That's that 21 step black and white wedge, because that's the thing that we use to calibrate these at a time. So I'd have 10 images plus one step wedge. And I would expose all of the red at one time, like it'd take a third of a day to do that. And then when I was ready to develop them, because they developed at different times, the red, the blue, and the green, I'd get them all ready. They'd be here in the dark. I'd get all the chemistry set up. And then I would set the clock for the development times for either the masks or the separation negatives. And some of those were quite long, ranging anywhere from about 8.5 minutes to 15 minutes. We would then develop them in steel hangers and these steel tanks. I would first insert them into a water pre-soak for 1 minute. I would then lift and drain, develop them for the required period of time, which might be anywhere from about 8.5 minutes up to about 15 minutes. I would lift and drain after putting them in for the first 30 seconds. After that, I would wait, and each minute I would lift and drain twice to each side. Putting them back in, letting them be quiet during the period. Then I would transfer them to the shortstop at the right time. Agitate continuously for 1 minute. Transfer them to the fixer. Agitate continuously for the first 30 seconds. And then every minute thereafter for the required period of time. Put it in hypo-clearing agent. This would make sure that any of the fixer was neutralized. It seemed like we did that for about a minute. And then I would bring it over here and put it in a big washer. And this would fill up with water, and they would have to wash in here for about 30 minutes to be archival. And once they were washed, then I would take the pre-soak and fill it with water and put photo flow in it, and this would help keep them from having any kind of water spots. And then we would hang them up on the line here in the same place that we hang the printers. So that's what would happen with the separation negatives. Our goal when I worked for Eliot was to make prints from 30 new images each month, and that meant making 60 masks and 90 separation negatives, plus the step wedges necessary for color balance. Then we went in there with the developed dried separations. We made the exposures on the matrix film, and now I'm going to show you that procedure. I mentioned this is a vacuum easel. What that means is that I can use a vacuum pump to draw down a vacuum, vacuum channels, these grooves in here, will actually draw the air out from under the piece of film once it's on there, and make sure that every part of it is really flat. Okay, and if I were to try and pull that up, you can hear the vacuum. Now once you've done that, you've lost your registration, so you'd have to start over. And what we would do is we have to punch this film before we exposed it, and then put it on the pins here. And then put this little frisket or mat on top of that, and this would make sure that we had really clean edges. And then I would be ready to make the exposure. We have to make the printers or matrices the exact size of the final print, because once we have made those matrices, this is not going to be a photographic process any longer. It's going to be essentially a mechanical process, very much like silkscreen, color silkscreen printing, or offset lithography. This is what the matrix film looked like when it came. It came in these foil packages. And once you had opened a foil package, you had to pretty much use it up within a month, because the humidity in the air would affect the material and actually cause atmospheric fogging. So this is 25 sheets of film, and it would also come with the little yellow pieces of paper for interleaving it once you had processed the film. So this would be in the box here. So I actually had a little light for this. This is orthochromatic film. So I would take out a piece of this, come over here to the punch it, set that on there, draw the vacuum, make sure everything was really calm and steady. You wouldn't have wanted to have bumped into the enlarger or bumped into the tabletop. Just make sure everything is as quiet as can be, and then make your exposure. Release the vacuum. Put the exposed film in. Turn the light on. Then you'd have to put the next negative in. Okay, now at this point, I'd have to clip one of the corners on the film. We actually had a little box. We'd put it in over here because you wanted to hear that little piece of film hit the box. Oop. Change the negative again. So that would be doing the blue negative, which is going to be the yellow printer. And this one I would cut 2 corners. Alright, now let's go into the other dark room, and I'll show you what we would do with all this exposed material. So anyway, let me show you what we would do for the matrix development. And we're just going to simulate this too, because it would require mixing a lot of chemicals. Once we had opened the containers they're in, they would go bad. We want 120 degree water. which is going to be right about it as hot as the hot water heater will produce it. We always had it turned up when I was working for him because we needed a lot of 120 degree water. Well, there would be, actually to start with, this would be empty. This would be a dilute stop bath with about 1% acetic acid in there. And this would be fixer, non-hardening fixer. And what I would do right prior to making the development run for this is I would have to pour out part B. The matrix was a two-part matrix developer. And it would be about 2 parts of B to 1 part of A. And I'm going to say that let's say we had, I have it marked here, 800 milliliters of B, and I would use about 400 milliliters of A. And I would pour, we're just simulating this. So I'd pour those out first, and then with thermometer, I would have to bring this to temperature, both of them 68 degrees. And when I had done all that in the light, then I would turn the lights off, and I would take a couple of really deep breaths, and I'd come over here, actually, I'd have the 3 sets of matrix film that I had exposed. I'd be wearing gloves. And if this was the real stuff, I would be wearing gloves right now. And I would hold these out here. I would pour the A into the B, and I would mix it, and then I would pour it into the tray, and then set this up. And it's a 2-minute developer, 2-minute development time. So I would set this up for 2 minutes plus 30 seconds, and I would start the timer. And I'd be watching for it to come around. I'd make sure everything was right. There were fluids in all the trays. I had this fanned out correctly. You can see no corners cut, 1 corner cut, 2 corners cut. So I'd know what they are. As it approached the time, okay, at 0, I would put 1 in, lift and drain. And notice I'm putting them emulsion down, lift and drain, and then put the last one in. Okay, and I had 15 seconds to interleave all 3 of them. It's 1, 2, and I'm a little ahead, 3. So I'm going to slow up just a tiny bit, but not much, because I want them to be consistent. So that's 1, 2, and actually I would do this between to make sure that the chemicals were properly dispersed. Okay, and that's what it is. Then that would make it just exactly 15 seconds per. Remember, this is a 2-minute development time. That's 1. You have to keep track of that because the first one that went in has to be the first one that comes out. And I can tell that by the corners that are cut. It's 1, 2, and it's almost time to take them out. So I have to do that in the same order that I did. So that's the cyan printer. Okay, and then we go on over to the fixer. Interleave it in the fixer for a couple of minutes. And by now there's an image on here. See, an image was built up while I was developing it in the first tray. And so I could see somewhat whether I was way off or not. After 2 minutes I could turn on the light and get ready for the next part of the procedure. And this was the part that really made the area steamy. This is the 120 degree water. I would fill that with hot water. I would take the first one and I have to turn it back emulsion up because at this point I'm going to be really vigorous. And this was actually a wash-off process. And what I'm doing by putting it in the hot water is I'm removing all of the unexposed gelatin. Wherever light struck the film, it would be from the negative. It's making a hardened image, and where the light did not strike, it's taking off the emulsion. And this, since there was no real image, it won't, of course, be that way. I would do this 3 times, and it's really important to be very physical with it. And these each would be 1-minute rinses. You see it's getting cleaner all the time. You have to give it a cold water chill down. So you'd have to rinse and drain in the chilled water and then hang it up to dry. You'd have to orient all 3 of them in the same way so that any shrinkage would be the same for all 3. And once it had dried and hardened, then you could set up for what you all have done and put the dyes out and run through that whole procedure. You have to mix the dyes with distilled water to make sure that you are consistent time after time and year after year, and decade after decade actually in this particular case. So I'm going to rinse these. The dyes are the heart of the process. If you mix them the same every time, then it's possible to go into the files, get a set of printers, bring them in, put them in the dyes, and basically reconstruct the same image that you did 30 or 40 or 50. I'm going to draw about 850 milliliters or cc's of distilled water, and we're going to mix the dyes in that and then bring it up to 1 liter or 1,000 cc's. And that'd be the working volume. This part is fairly critical. So when you all want to remix dyes, it's certain parts of this are extremely critical. Being consistent with the volumes. In mixing the dyes, you have dye concentrate and you have what's called dye buffer. And what you have to do is mix equal amounts of the dye and the buffer, but in sequence. And to make 1 liter of working solution, you need 50 cc's of dye. And the way you measure the dye is from the bottom of the meniscus. You know, it tries to crawl up the sides. Yeah. And it's really hard to see the magenta and the cyan meniscus. So here, the top of it comes to just that little hook on the 5. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to use that as my reference because you won't be able to see that, especially with the cyan. So I'm putting the dye in, and it's really important to conserve all of the stuff that's in there. So I'm going to rinse that little bit of extra dye with a little distilled water. And then I'm going to add the buffer to the same unit here without rinsing it. And this will help to rinse out what little bit is left in there. And if you do this the same each time, then whatever irregularities there are, it's all right as long as you're consistent with them. Consistency is much more important than any absolute number. What we want to do at this point is bring the total volume up to that 1,000 mark. Okay, and now we're going to have to get careful about this. You see in there how it's the bottom of that little dip that comes to it. And once again, the top of the meniscus comes to just about where the zeros close on that. So that's what we'll use for the reference on that. Okay, and that's going to go in the yellow dye tray. You have to be very careful to rinse all of the previous color out before mixing the next one. Use a little distilled water to rinse that tap water out of there. can take a long time for the bubbles to break and for you to figure out how much you really have in there. So equal amounts, 50 cc's of each. Oops. Yeah, that was it. Okay, now.
Did you put a drop of the dye in the buffer so you could tell which?
No, it comes that way, but that's the reason they do that, so that you don't put yellow buffer in the magenta. That's what actually brings the dyes to balance. When they make a batch, or used to, when Kodak would make a batch, they wouldn't be necessarily balanced, and they would do that through the use of the buffers. I used to dread mixing dyes because we'd mix them a gallon at a time, and if you made a mistake, there was a lot of wasted dye. I discard them after about 20 or 25 prints. Theoretically, you could keep replenishing them for a long time, but they lose a certain depth when you do that. And they're not as repeatable. You can always add more, you can't take it out. So go slow at this point. Okay, what we've mixed up here are what are called normal acid dyes. This would be a normal contrast, a mid-range contrast. And Eliot liked to use high contrast dyes, high acid dyes as they're called. So now we have to go back and do that after I clean up these things. What we have to do is mix up some 28% acetic acid. The 28% ought to also be made out of distilled water. We're going to want 80 cc's of distilled water. I'm going to mix it in here. So I'm going to do 50 and 30 with this graduate. And remember, you add acid to water, not water to acid. So now we're going to add 30 cc's of acetic acid. Remember, this stuff will really burn you if you get it on you, especially you don't want to get it in your eye. Now the proportions for making high acid dyes are, you add 21 cc's of the 28% to the cyan, you add 12 cc's to the magenta, and 47 cc's to the yellow. So we're going to put 21 cc's. Make sure it's dispersed. We're going to do 12 in the magenta. These are determined by Kodak. This is on the information sheet. This is how to make a standard high acid or high contrast dye. And see, Eliot had two sets here. He had normal and then high acid here. In some pictures, which are real high contrast to begin with, you would probably print in the normal acid dye. And then pictures which are a little lower in contrast, you would print in the high acid dye. He liked very high contrast, high saturation, a lot of color, a lot of density to his color. And then 47 for the yellow. So this is 2 cc's in 2,000 cc's of water, and this is going to be the pre-soak. We need to mix 3 different concentrations of acetic acid to use while handling the mats. The first would be for the pre-soak of the mats, and that would consist of just 2 cc's of glacial acetic acid in 2,000 cc's of water. The second would be for the first rinse and for the holding bath, and that would consist of 20 cc's of glacial acetic acid in 2,000 cc's of water. And the third would be 50 cc's of glacial acetic acid in 2,000 cc's of water, and that's what we would rinse the matrices in before hanging them up to dry at the end of printing. This is the paper conditioner. This is just an acidified hand rinse that I'm making up here so I can be sure and neutralize the alkaline materials before putting my hands in the dyes. If I didn't, it would destroy the dyes. Now we need to put out some paper to soak. Ordinarily you want to soak the paper for about 20 minutes minimum before making a print. Putting the paper in face down, and then turn it over face up just to be sure I wipe the surface clean, and then I'm going to turn it face down again to let it soak. And these need to be pre-soaked. If you don't wet them first, when you put them in the dye, sometimes they dye up unevenly. They'll leave watermarks or water spots. This has no corners clipped. It's the cyan. So put this in with the emulsion up and let it soak in the dye for at least 5 minutes, and it will just go to what's called saturation. It will take on as much dye as it can and no more. And each of these matrices is like a very delicate sponge. And the parts of the image that will be dark are very thick, and the parts of the image that will be light are very thin. So normal first rinse would be 200 cc's of 1% acetic acid with no amendments. No additional acetic acid and no sodium acetate. If we added acetic acid to this, it would make a higher acid dye bath for the first rinse, and that would keep more color in. If we use the sodium acetate, which is slightly more alkaline, that would reduce the acidity of the first dye bath, and that would take a little dye out. And we're going to time it. There's a standard rinse time of 1 minute. And there's a drain of about 10 seconds. And this needs to be fairly vigorous because we're actually physically washing the surface of the printer or the matrix to get any excess dye off and to make sure that the dye that's on there is uniformly adhering. At this point in the process, it's really more of a physical process than it is a photographic process. It's much more like color silkscreen printing or offset lithography at this point than a true photographic process. Drain it for about the same amount of time we did pulling it out. We need to replenish the dye concentrate. We're going to put 20 drops. You notice it's just the adhesion of the wet paper sticking this down to the rolling board here. Pick up the matrix, which is emulsion side up, and I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to bring the end with the little punched holes over the pins. Make sure that's flat. Reach around, then I'm going to roll the matrix in contact with the paper, and that's why it's called rolling a print. And at this point, the dye is transferring out of the matrix into the paper, which has been soaking in an alkaline solution. All of the dyes and all of the other fluids we've had the matrices in are acidic. We brought it in contact now with the alkaline paper, and there's an ionic affinity, a chemical affinity, that tends to draw the acidic dyes into the alkaline paper. And we'll just let that be very quiet, undisturbed, for at least 5 to 7 minutes. And during that period, all of that dye will transfer out, and we'll just have the matrix left without any dye. All these little housekeeping things to do while the dyes are transferring: interleave the paper, make sure the next matrix is ready to go, and make sure you've replenished. So I think this has probably been on here long enough. You can see the dye is on the page and it's been removed from the matrix. Hence dye transfer. This great little washer was an invention of Eliot's. The Kodak instructions say to wash the matrices in a tray of gently flowing water, but it takes a whole lot more water to do that than this little bit of water sliding over. Again, I'm going to lift this, turn it over, get a little bead of acetic acid. Having all of the different trays covered keeps them from being contaminated and also keeps the smell down. There's a lot of acetic acid involved in this, and it gets to smelling like a pickle factory pretty quick. You can extend this rinse time 2 or 3 minutes, depending on whether you're trying to take more dye out of a particular matrix or add more to it. So all the dyes are on there at this point, and the title of this was Blue Vitrified Lava, so it's going to be blue. I'm going to do something that Eliot didn't do, but which I found makes the prints a little more permanent and they don't bleed as much. I'm going to give them a little bit of an acetic acid wipe off before putting it in the blotters. So this is just some of that 1% acetic acid. The dyes are slowly transferring in there now and showing us a little bit of warm tone in here, and there's some pine needles and so forth in there. And first time I rolled this, I thought, well, that looks pretty good for the first print. Eliot came in and said, I think I wanted a little darker, so he wanted another one rolled. So for the first part of this second print on the lava, Eliot's picture, we will do a normal print. No, I added dye to all 3 and then did a re-dye as well. So we'll do the same. Let's see how that looks. Now on this I'm going to do the re-dye and then I'm going to put it straight in here without draining, which is a little bit of a different procedure. See, there's very little. There's just the faintest amount, but that'll make a big difference in the final print. I think I'm going to make it for 7, since this dye is a little bit on the warm side. can see already that it's quite a bit denser. It's at least a third to half a stop darker than the first one. Of course, we're looking through the silver that's still in the matrix, so it's hard to come to a final conclusion on it. And you can see how much denser, how much darker it is than the first one. And that's just from those few seconds of re-dye in each of the three colors. And my inclination is actually to hit it one more time with a little more yellow. You just have virtually infinite control over each separate color. The faster they dry, the sharper they are. There's less dye bleed. And the term that's used for making dye transfer prints is actually building a print. And you can see that that's what we did based on what we had at the beginning, and then with the addition of a little bit more cyan, a little bit more magenta, and a little bit more yellow, plus a last application of yellow. In the pine needles now, with their nice kind of yellowish or tannish color standing out, some of the brownish weathered rock stands out now. It's not pale like it was in this one. It has the depth and solidity that is characteristic of dye transfer prints.
I love you, pumpkin.
I love you, honey bunny.